since the beginning of time and before. There is seldom anything as profound as the Creator's Spirit as seen through humankind. Testimony proudly presents the stories of individuals, vessels who set themselves aside to find fullness, heroes who found honor in humility, Spirit-inspired lives that would change the world for eternity. Join us as we proudly present the testimony of Fanny Crosby. Throughout the history of the Christian Church, hymns have built a bridge between the tangible world and the spiritual realm. Hymns have offered comfort to the grieving at funerals, jubilation and promise during weddings, and hymns have echoed compassion and hope during times of war. The early 1800s was a time of growth and conflict for the young nation of the United States. The anti-slavery abolitionists of the North were just organizing, and there was unrest in the South. James Monroe, who had penned the famous Monroe Doctrine, was the presiding president. It was into this world that Frances Jane Crosby was born. Fanny, as she came to be called, went from a near-hopeless situation to become one of the most influential American figures of her time. John and Mercy Crosby were blessed with their first child, a daughter, on March 24, 1820. Frances Jane was born in Putnam County, 75 miles north of New York City. The Crosbys were people of simple means, making a living off the land. As an infant, Fanny contracted an eye infection. The family physician from the nearest village was away, so the Crosbys sought the aid of another country doctor.
What are you doing?
Hot mustard poultice.
On her eyes?
Madam, I am the physician.
When the man was finished with his treatment, Fanny quickly lost all sight. Baby Fanny was blinded. It was later learned that the man was not a qualified doctor. He left town after learning the results of his destructive prescription. When Fanny was nearly a year old, the family was struck by tragedy once again. Her father, John, had become ill while working his land. He succumbed to pneumonia a short time after. Mercy, now widowed, was forced to take a job, leaving young Fanny in the care of her mother. Fanny was an adventurous and curious child, taking in the sounds and fragrances flowing around her. She would even play hide and seek with the other children, finding her way by the sound of their breathing and avoiding obstacles by sensing their shadows.
Jane, you always find me.
This encouragement of vivid childhood experiences is what laid the groundwork for Fanny's poetic mind and comprehension of visible things. The wind across her cheeks, the thunder clapping in the distance, and the sounds of nature formed a heightened sense of wonder that molded her spirit and poet's vision. Her family was a significant influence in Fanny's formative years. Her grandmother spent long hours reading the Bible to her. Fanny absorbed scripture like a sponge. She could recite much of the New Testament, Proverbs, Ruth, and several other books of the Bible.
Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
Her unparalleled powers of memorization and love of the poetic were to become the tools of her trade and the means to change the lives of so many people. Throughout this time, Mercy Crosby held firmly to the belief that Fanny's blindness was only a temporary condition. And so, Mercy arranged for Fanny to see an eye specialist in New York City. The neighbors banded together and collected enough money to pay for the trip. At the age of 5, as other children her age were starting school, Fanny and her mother were making a life-changing trip. While Fanny was likely overwhelmed with the new smells, sounds, and energy of the city, her mother's intense focus was in the hope of good news from the doctor.
Is there nothing you can do?
But the damage to Fanny's eyes was irreversible. She would never regain her sight.
Fanny was very unique as a blind child because of the fact that she was never treated at home as a blind child. She was taught to do things just like other children.
People don't think of blind people the same as other people, and that's wrong, Frances. So you've got to show them that you're different. You're going to have to educate yourself because they can't teach you in the normal school. Do you understand, Frances?
Yes, Grandmother.
This kind nurturing from her family gave her an optimistic outlook on life. Shortly after her trip to New York City, she wrote,
Oh, what a happy soul I am. Although I cannot see, I am resolved that in this world contented I will be. How many blessings I enjoy that other people don't. To weep inside because I'm blind? I cannot nor I won't.
Although Fanny was content with being blind, she was unwilling to fit into the box that society would put blind people. She yearned for more.
The night was beautiful. I crept toward the window and through the branches of a giant oak that stood just outside. The soft moonlight fell upon my head like the benediction of an angel. Dear Lord, please show me how I can learn like the other children. At this moment, the weight of anxiety that had burdened my heart was changed to sweet consciousness that my prayer would be answered in due time.
From the time Fanny was 8 years old, she prayed every evening that God would find a place where she could learn. She would go attend the local schools, the regular schools, but the teachers at that time didn't know how to teach blind students. So to cover their own inadequacy, they would tell her she was stupid, she couldn't learn, and send her home. Or they would let her sit there, just sit in class while the other children read and went out for recess. And Fanny was just very bored. And she could do everything the other children could do except read. And the teachers just didn't know how to teach her. But inside of that little girl was a genius, needed to be brought out.
In 1829, when Fanny was 9 years of age, the family moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut, and into the home of the Hollies, a wealthy Quaker family where Mercy had taken a job. An afternoon in the Hollies' parlor meant listening to the words of the English literary masters and enjoying the company of those who loved fine art and culture. As she listened to the words of Milton, who was also blind, her love of verse took firm root. Soon she began to compose in her own mind, filing away unfinished poems. The powerful memory she had cultivated was now being refined. Only when the poems were complete would she enlist the help of a trusted friend to commit the results to paper for others to see.
Its scenes will in our memories dwell.
Meanwhile, the New York Institution for the Blind was opening its doors. Although Fanny didn't realize it yet, this institution would soon play a major role in her life. The opening of the New York Institute for the Blind gave young Fanny the opportunity she'd been praying for. At the age of 15, with her mother's assistance, Fanny applied to the school.
Institute, you've been accepted.
The city that had been the site of a disappointing trip was suddenly filled with hope and promise. She was going to learn like other children, While Fanny Crosby was eager to be taught in the academics, the philosophy behind educating the blind in 1835 was more focused on vocational training. Determined to pursue her own interest, the crafting of words, Fanny struggled against the insistence of her teachers that she devote herself to more practical goals. But not all the faculty was so narrow-minded. The superintendent of the school, Dr. Russ, encouraged Fanny, and she came to deeply respect the principal who, she found out later in life, had been so dedicated to the school that he once worked for 2 entire years without drawing a penny in wages.
The New York Institution for the Blind was a unique and new type of schooling. So everyone, politicians and famous people, went to visit the blind school to look at it. And Fanny was their poet in residence, which meant that anytime someone came to visit the school, she would recite one of her poems as a welcome to them. So she came to know everyone who came through there, all the presidents and politicians and famous people. During her lifetime at the school, she came to know 22 of our presidents, from John Quincy Adams to Woodrow Wilson.
On one of these dignitary visits, William Cullen Bryant, a famous poet of the day, came across some of Fanny's work.
Do you have a Francis Crosby?
Francis, stand up, please.
Francis Crosby. An excellent young lady. Excellent. I have been reading your poems. Yes, I have. And you have the making of a great poet someday, but you have to work at it. I shall observe your future with great interest.
He only gave her a few small words of encouragement, but Fanny was deeply touched by Bryant's small offering of inspiration.
He never knew how much he did by those few words.
Years at the Institute, while academically fulfilling, offered Fanny many opportunities to be the mischievous, playful child that she was. On one occasion, she snuck a watermelon from the school's garden, an act of rebellion on behalf of all the students who were upset that the fruit was going to be sold before they could enjoy it. And occasionally, she would describe a school subject through poetry.
Tell us the poem, Fanny. Multiplication is vexation. Division is as bad. The rule of 3 puzzles me, and fractions make me mad.
As Fanny moved swiftly through her studies, she became known among the school staff as a gifted student.
Come in.
Upon graduation, the institution offered her a teaching position. At the age of 22, Fanny was put on the school's payroll and began to instruct young minds on the wonders of rhetoric and history. This posting not only gave her a respected place in society, it also gave her a platform from which to recite and circulate her creative verse.
Such joy in thee.
1 year later, in the autumn of 1843, Frances was given an extraordinary opportunity. Hoping to gain financial assistance for the blind, the New York Institute sent Fanny and others to address Congress on Capitol Hill. The audience included John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, and Jefferson Davis, the only man ever to be President of the Confederate States of America. Fanny Crosby was to be the first woman to ever address the Senate and Congress.
In the 19th century, disabled people did not have very many rights, and Fanny Crosby was invited to speak to the Senate and the Congress. She was in fact the first woman ever asked to speak to these government leaders, and the purpose of her visit there was to make the case that disabled people can and should and ought to lead a productive role in society. She was very convincing. She endeared herself to the government leaders and was very influential in making her point.
I think of that rustic village, secluded as once it stood, with its dwelling so unpretending.
Fanny selected several of her favorite poems, and when it was time for her to speak, recited them with understated conviction. The words spoke for themselves. When she had finished reciting the first poem, there was a prolonged period of silence. Unable to see the faces of the audience members, she began to dread that their silence signified disapproval. She was completely shocked when a thunderous wave of applause suddenly washed over her, the noise overwhelming her keen sense of hearing. In the years that followed that first trip to the capital, the young teacher recited her poetry to many public figures. One of these, President James Polk, became a close friend of Fanny's, sometimes dropping by the school unannounced in order to avoid the pomp and pageantry that usually accompanied the arrival of someone in his position. He would walk the school's grounds with the poet and encourage her to allow kindness to always rule her conduct, a principle he strove to uphold as president. Another visitor to the Institute was General Scott, who had earned the nickname Rough and Ready Scott during the Mexican War. After the usual formal ceremony had finished, the general was busy admiring the school when Fanny and an accomplice decided to liven the occasion.
General Scott, you are my prisoner.
But as Fanny's playful personality was asserting itself, a tragedy was brewing across the Atlantic that would affect her life as well as the lives of all New Yorkers. In the autumn of 1848, the deadly Asiatic cholera was sweeping Europe, killing millions. It took less than a year for the plague to reach North America. New York was its first stop. Authorities frantically tried to stamp out the disease, but their efforts were in vain.
What is it?
It's Margaret!
The staff of the New York Institute braced themselves for the worst.
Fanny became a volunteer to help with the students that became ill, and one of her favorite students, a little girl of 8 years old, came down with the cholera. Fanny was in the habit of rocking her in the evenings, and she asked Fanny one evening if she would rock her while she was sick. And while Fanny was rocking her, she said, "You can put me down, Miss Crosby. In the morning, I'll be with the Lord." And then Fanny talked about the next morning. She carried her body down to the Trinity Church in New York City and buried her in the Trinity Cemetery.
A skilled physician named J.W.G. Clemens instructed Fanny on making a medicine he had devised to bring down the disease. Desperate by today's measures, the mixture consisted of 3 parts mercury and 1 part opium rolled into pills. To meet the needs of the endangered pupils, Fanny switched roles from teacher to nurse, putting herself at great risk. She spent her days comforting those who were past hope and treating those who could still be saved. She recalled that one evening, while hurrying through a classroom turned hospital, she struck her foot against an object, instantly recognizing the dull thud of an occupied coffin. And now Fanny was certain that she too had developed symptoms of the disease. Without telling her peers, Fanny took a large quantity of the cholera pills she'd been making. The smell of death was everywhere in the summer of 1849. As the epidemic ravaged New York City, Fanny, like thousands of others, was sent to less populated, healthier places to recuperate. The end of the epidemic came with the first frosts of fall.
Our fair city needs you once again. Please return to your homes and aid us in returning New York to the noble metropolis it deserves to be. The mayor.
Death and disaster force us to question our lives. Catastrophe causes many people to consider their spiritual state. And so, in 1850, revival meetings sprang up throughout New York. The narrow escape from a fatal disease and the grief of nearly everyone's loss caused a great deal of hunger for the gospel message and the soothing words of Jesus. Fanny had been attending weekly meetings at the 13th Street Methodist Church since 1839. Her recent close call with death caused her to listen closer than ever to the words that rang out from the pulpit. Mr. Theodore Camp, a well-respected teacher in the city school system, attended the meetings with Fanny. Camp and Fanny developed a friendship, and although he never forced the gospel message on her, Fanny was impressed by the man's conviction in his faith. Then, one night, Fanny Crosby had a dramatic dream.
The sky was cloudy for days, and I felt summoned to the side of my friend.
Fanny, can you give up our friendship?
I cannot. You have been my advisor and my friend. What would I do without your aid?
Why would you change the spirit of earth? It longs to fly away and be at rest. Will you meet me in heaven?
The dream compelled Fanny to reconsider her spiritual state. On the evening of November 20th, 1850, at age 30, Fanny Crosby finally felt the peace of God wash over her when she asked Christ to take charge of her life. It seems odd that someone raised to memorize and recite the Bible, who often labored under the banner of Christian charity, would reach out to God so late in life. However, despite Fanny's desire to be a productive Christian woman, she realized there was more to faith than the accumulation of deeds.
My very soul was flooded with celestial light. And then, for the first time, I realized that I had been trying to hold the world in one hand and the Lord in the other.
Today, gentlemen, we are going to speak about a very important time in the history of America.
In 1855, the New York Institute hired another blind prodigy, Alexander Van Alstyne.
Technically,
although their relationship was platonic for several years, Alexander and Fanny's friendship eventually blossomed into love. In the spring of 1858, Fanny ended her 23 years at the Institute to marry Van Alstyne, a union which was to last for 44 years. They moved to Maspeth, a part of Queens. Fanny had looked forward to married life and motherhood. Her joy was unrestrained. Alexander insisted that Fanny use her maiden name, since it was already so well known. And so, although she was legally Frances Van Alstyne, she was always known as Fanny Crosby in public. Van Alstyne wrote the music for several of Fanny's hymns, but he lived quietly in the shadow of her success. The following year, Fanny gave birth to their first and only child, a baby girl. Fanny was ecstatic, but tragedy was about to strike again.
In 1859, Alexander and Fanny had a baby, and Fanny was excited about it. There had to be a little fear involved also, that how would two blind people raise a child back in the mid-1800s. But they lost the child in infancy. She was just a few months old when they lost her. And Fanny and Van never really spoke publicly about it. It was the worst experience either one of them had ever gone through, and neither one of them dealt very well with it. The hymn that she wrote, Safe in the Arms of Jesus, was written as a poem for her baby when she died.
Even today, that hymn continues to comfort people devastated by the loss of a loved one.
Safe in the arms of Jesus, safe on his gentle breast, there by his love o'ershaded, sweetly my soul shall rest.
Following the death of their only child, Fanny Crosby and her husband sought comfort at church and attended regularly. The minister there insisted that she introduce herself to Mr. William B. Bradbury, a famous composer who was looking for someone to write hymn lyrics to accompany his music.
Now, what can I do for you?
I think, Mr. Bradbury, that it's more a question of what I can do for you. I hear that you were looking for a lyricist. Here are my credentials.
I've seen much of your work. I think it would be best if I just played the melody for you.
That would be acceptable.
Well?
Very good. I shall return on the morrow.
After impressing the publisher with her abilities, Fanny's next assignment was more challenging. Bradbury had an urgent need for a patriotic tune, so he suggested that she write the words to the melody "Forest Trees," which had been used to stir the troops during the Civil War. Several days later, she returned to Bradbury's office to present him with the finished song. The composer wasn't in, but the bookkeeper, also a musical man, played the hymn on the piano, amazed at the new words.
We shall dwell in love together, there shall be no parting there. How in the world did you manage to write that hymn? Nobody ever supposed that you or any other mortal could adapt the words to that melody.
As long as I have a publishing house, you will always have work.
Fanny and Mr. Bradbury worked together for 4 years, and then he died. Fanny was just crushed and heartbroken because they'd worked so well together and written scores of hymns. And L.H. Bigelow and Sylvester Maine then bought Mr. Bradbury's publishing firm, and it became the Bigelow and Maine publishing firm, and they took Fanny on as a writer.
In their time, they were the largest single publishers of gospel music, and so that she had this connection with them really helped her in the dissemination of music to many, many people.
The exciting thing for Fanny was that she had known Sylvester Maine from Ridgefield when she was just a little girl. They had played tag, and Fanny was it, and she was chasing the students, and she ran into a tree. Fanny began to pick herself up, and she realized that there was a little boy there, and he helped her stand up and brushed her dress off and tied her bow and helped her walk home. And Fanny was just so horrified and embarrassed. She said, "I just can't imagine how I ran into the tree," because the shade from the tree, the coolness in the shade, always warned her that she was getting close to the center of the tree. And the little boy said, "Well, the tree's been dead for years." The little boy that walked her home and helped her brush the dirt off that day was Sylvester Maine. When Fanny left for the institution at the age of 14, they didn't see each other again until many years later, when Sylvester Maine was one of the purchasers of Mr. Bradbury's firm.
She went on to work for the Bigelow and Maine Company for more than 34 years, and Fanny did not limit herself to songwriting. As an accomplished singer and musician, she, with her husband, would perform in concerts for the public. But it was still her songwriting that she was best known for. In 1866, Philip Phillips published a collection of hymns called The Singing Pilgrim. He sent Fanny 40 titles requiring lyrics. Here's where Fanny's extraordinary memory really came into play. She wrote, revised, and completed every one of the 40 songs in her mind and put it to memory.
And then dictated all 40 in one shot to somebody who is transcribing them. I can't imagine reciting 40 hymns myself, any 40 hymns that I know in one shot, and I've been singing hymns for many years. So really, it's quite astonishing.
In her autobiography, she describes how she wrote 2 volumes this way, 80 songs in all, adding that she was not trying to boast. Rather, she wanted to impress upon readers the incredible power of the mind and inspire them to new heights. Praise and worship seemed to burst from Fanny's soul. Years of Bible memorization gave her the knowledge to compose theologically sound hymns, and her poetic vision and childlike love of nature inspired rich metaphors and beautiful imagery describing the glory of creation in harmony with the Spirit of God.
The most enduring hymns are born in the silences of the soul, and nothing must be allowed to intrude while they are being framed into language.
In 1873, Fanny was visited by her best friend, Phoebe Knapp. Phoebe and Fanny were very good friends. They did a lot of things together, shopping and all the girl things. Well, they were visiting one evening, and Fanny said that Phoebe sat down at her husband Van's piano and began to play a tune. She told Fanny, "God has given me this tune, but he hasn't given me any words to fit it." "Fanny," Phoebe said, "does God give you any words for my tune?" Fanny said that she sat down in her rocking chair, and in the next 5 minutes, she put together the words to Blessed Assurance.
The crusading team of Dwight L. Moody and Ira Sankey did more to popularize Fanny's hymns than anyone else. In mass crusades that swept throughout Europe and American cities such as Chicago, New York, and Boston, the 2 evangelists spoke and sang to tens of thousands of people. It was at these meetings that Blessed Assurance was first embraced by the masses.
Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine.
It has become an old standby that continues to echo throughout thousands of church services every Sunday.
In her day, Fanny Crosby was immensely popular. She was the most prolific composer of this type of music. She was the most published composer of this type of music, and she was the most popular composer of this type of music. Virtually everybody who attended church during this time in American history, and indeed in other countries as well, would have sung the music of Fanny Crosby.
Fanny Crosby often went to the Bowery, a ghetto of the destitute, where she did what she could to help and inspire the poor and the lost gathered at the various missions. The Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, was at its height at the time, and Fanny was often invited to speak. Conductors, porters, and other railway workers had started their own Bible studies and prayer meetings, eventually becoming an official branch of the YMCA. Fanny called them the Railroad Boys, and they held a special place in her heart.
How I would like to shake your hands and greet you one by one, but we are now too far apart, and this cannot be done. Yet I can hope and wish and pray that heaven's eternal joys may fall like dew upon your heads, my noble railroad boys.
She made a connection with people where they were at. She understood the common person. She understood suffering. She understood the yearnings that the average person on the street had. And she had a particular genius for communicating these ideas with sincerity and clarity and an almost rugged simplicity that just appealed to a majority of people.
One evening, Fanny went to the Bowery Mission to minister. She began her speech, and she said her tongue stumbled. She paused for a moment and then said, "Please forgive this lapse." Then she said she felt a sudden curious urge, and she heard herself say, "There's a young man here tonight who has turned his back on things of God and his parents." She went on with her speech, and she said it flowed along freely. But after the meeting, a young man approached her and said, "I believe I'm the young man you spoke of." She said, "I believe your mother is a godly woman, is she not?" And he said, "Oh, she was." And Fanny said she took him by the hand and knelt down on that filthy floor of the mission that night and led him in a prayer to the Lord. She said after they stood up, his voice burst out loud. He said, "Now I can meet my mother in heaven, for I have found her God." Fanny said later that evening, as she rocked in the quiet, she savored the memories, and she thought, what if no one would have gone to the mission that night? That young man could still be lost. And that evening she put together the words to a new hymn. This one she wrote for the people who should be witnessing the gospel.
By 1906, the hymnal series Gospel Hymns and Sacred Songs, to which Fanny had contributed extensively, had sold over 15 million copies worldwide. Fanny donated all her royalties to a collection of charities and seminaries.
Indeed, she died with only $2,000 in her estate. She was a humble, generous, gracious, giving woman, and fame and fortune were not important to her in the least. That's one of the reasons she's such an amazing woman when we consider her life and her legacy.
Often, the songbird wrote 6 hymns a day, turning them out so quickly that her publishers found they had a unique problem. The public of that day expected a collection of hymns to be written by various authors, not just one. So publishers began to employ pen names. In all, Fanny Crosby used over 250 different pen names during her publishing career, including James Apple, Rose Atherton, Henrietta E. Blair, Frank Gould, Victoria Stewart, and many, many others. In all, it is believed that she wrote well over 10,000 hymns, all after the age of 43.
In its day, the music for Fanny Crosby's hymns was quite conservative. However, it was conservative perhaps for a reason. People needed to sing this, and frequently there would be gatherings of hundreds or even thousands of people singing these songs together. That these hymns were conservative in their time now seems almost irrelevant. The important thing is these hymns have been around and are still around. They have been popular and they have been enjoyed and they continue to be enjoyed for such a long time.
Fanny was an artist, and like other artists, she had her little idiosyncrasies.
It has been my custom to hold a little book in my hand, and somehow or other, the words seem to come more promptly when I'm so engaged. I can also remember more accurately when this little volume is in my grasp.
Over the years, people noting this curious habit have asked some strange questions. Judging from pictures of the songstress, that book was always with her. This led some to believe that she could really see. In 1900, Fanny and Alexander Van Alstyne moved in with family in Bridgeport. It was 2 years later, in 1902, that Fanny's longtime husband and partner of 44 years died. Fanny continued to age gracefully, always making new friends along the way. During the last months of her life, many visitors claimed she seemed to glow with a radiant light. Right until her last hours, she showed more concern for others than herself. On her last night alive, she dictated a letter of comfort to a grieving friend who had just lost her daughter. It was the morning of February 12, 1915, when Frances Jane Crosby finally saw her savior. Fanny's funeral was the biggest Bridgeport had ever seen. People lined up for blocks to view the coffin, and many dignitaries and politicians attended. Fanny had insisted on a simple grave, preferring the money be used to help the poor and needy. Initially, her small gravestone carried the terse statement, "She hath done what she could." In 1955, the citizens of Bridgeport replaced the stone with a more fitting tribute. The chorus to Blessed Assurance now forms the central portion of her epitaph. Fanny Crosby had never shown resentment or regret about being blind, or even about the charlatan who took her eyesight from her in her infancy. In fact, she appreciated the fact that her disability gave her deeper insight into spiritual matters. A century has passed since Fanny Crosby wrote most of her hymns, and throughout that century, the inspired words of the most prolific lyricist of all time have rung out more than those of any other songwriter in history. The New York Institute is still going strong as an educator of blind children. Though others have deeply contributed to its cause, Fanny is still recognized as one of the school's most treasured alumnus. Her friendships with men like President James Polk must have affected the course of the nation, although it is difficult to measure the full impact of these unions. Yet, there are thousands of others. People from the Boweries and railway lines who weren't from society's elite, which were given a gift from the poet. They were given the gift of truth, the love of God, by someone who could not see their haggard, distraught faces, but saw something deeper instead, light in their souls, and the promise that they could overcome whatever disability the world had placed upon them. The last verse she wrote was not one of a despairing and dying woman, but a joyful, hopeful saint about to see joy face to face.
In the morn of Zion's glory, when the clouds have rolled away, and my hope has dropped its anchor in the veil of perfect day, when with all the pure and holy I shall strike my harp anew, with a power no arm can sever, love will hold me fast and true.
Some of you likely grew up singing many of those familiar songs. Perhaps you know them by memory. It's been reported that Fanny Crosby wrote more verse than any other human being in history. Perhaps she did. It's also been reported that Fanny Crosby was twice nominated as the most important woman in the USA. Well, we haven't been able to verify that, but we do know she is very important to us. Thank you for watching Testimony. I'm Rick Castiglione. We'll see you next time.